With respect, Mr. Al-Rostamani, what you just said will cost them everything they've built. The conference room on the 42nd floor of Al-Rostamani Global Holdings fell silent. Not the comfortable silence of contemplation, but the suffocating kind that follows a gunshot in a cathedral. 12 executives, men in charcoal suits with 7-figure salaries and egos to match, turned their heads in synchronized disbelief toward the source of the interruption. At the head of the obsidian conference table sat Abdullah Al-Rostamani, CEO of a multinational conglomerate worth $8.7 billion. His white kandura was immaculate, his gutra secured with a gold aggle that caught the late afternoon sun streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. Behind him, the Manhattan skyline glittered like a kingdom awaiting its king's command. Moments earlier, he'd spoken in rapid Gulf Arabic, a linguistic maneuver designed to bypass the American legal team's comprehension, leaving only his translator, Dylan Wade, privy to the real terms being discussed. What Al-Rostamani hadn't expected was that the woman refilling water glasses understood every word. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now, let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. Standing against the back wall, a silver tray of bottled water balanced in her hands, was J.C. Griffin. Her black uniform with white trim was pressed crisp, despite the long shift, her name tag glinting under the recessed lighting. She stood with her back straight, not defiant, but dignified. A woman who had learned long ago that invisibility was survival in rooms like this, but today, survival wasn't enough. Griffin's voice had been steady when she spoke, her Arabic flawless, carrying the particular cadence of someone who hadn't just learned the language in a classroom. She'd lived in it, breathed it, and negotiated million-dollar deals in it. The shock rippling through the room wasn't just that she'd spoken, it was that she'd spoken truth. Al-Rostamani's dark eyes narrowed, studying her with the intensity of a man accustomed to being the most informed person in any room. His fingers, which had been drumming lightly on the polished table, went still. "You speak Arabic?" His English was smooth, Oxford-educated, but edged with steel. Griffin responded in the same Gulf dialect he'd used moments before, her voice clear and unapologetic. "And I understand the difference between a partnership clause and a takeover disguised as one." A sharp intake of breath came from Sean Gregory, the lead counsel from the American side, a silver-haired man whose Rolex probably cost more than Griffin's annual salary. He leaned toward Romy Dean, Al-Rostamani's personal assistant, who stood frozen near the door, iPad clutched to her chest like a shield. "Is she staff?" he hissed, loud enough for the room to hear. "She's housekeeping," someone muttered from the far end of the table. But Griffin's eyes never left Al-Rostamani. She set the water tray down on the nearby credenza with deliberate care, then straightened her posture. "What you said. This structure allows flexibility for regional adaptation. The way you phrased it creates a backdoor. You could nullify their board decisions retroactively. That's not collaboration, Mr. Al-Rostamani. It's colonization with a signature." Dylan Wade, the translator seated beside Al-Rostamani, looked down at his notes. Beads of sweat formed at his temples. His pen, which had been moving steadily across the page moments before, now lay motionless. Al-Rostamani leaned forward, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Do you have legal training, miss?" He paused, waiting. "Griffin. J.C. Griffin." She switched to English now, matching his formal tone. "I have a master's degree in Middle Eastern Studies and International Law from Georgetown. I spent 4 years working for Al-Fahad and Associates in Riyadh corporate mergers and cross-border compliance." She paused, the next words costing her more than she'd expected. "Before my mother, Imani Turner, got sick, I came home to care for her after she passed." Her voice didn't waver, but something in her eyes did. "The gap on my resume became a wall. Employers stopped seeing my credentials. They just saw my name, my skin." The room seemed to tilt. Colton Avery, a junior analyst near the window, leaned over to Sean Gregory and whispered, "She might actually be right about the clause." Al-Rostamani's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. His gaze shifted to Dylan Wade, who had gone pale. "How long have you known she was correct?" The translator stammered, looking between his notes and his employer. I thought the language was... Leave. Al Rostamani's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. Dylan Wade gathered his briefcase with shaking hands and hurried out, the door closing behind him with a muted click that seemed to echo in the stillness. Griffin stood motionless, heart hammering against her ribs. She could feel the weight of a dozen stares, some skeptical, some curious, some openly resentful. She'd just challenged a billionaire in front of his peers, exposed his translator's incompetence, and potentially derailed a multi-million-dollar deal. She'd either be thanked, escorted out by security, or both. Al Rostamani turned to Sean Gregory, his expression unreadable. This meeting is postponed. We will reconvene tomorrow at noon. I suggest you bring someone who understands what they're signing. He stood, adjusting his gutra with the same meticulous care he brought to everything. The room remained frozen as he walked toward the exit. As he passed Griffin, he paused. His eyes, dark, calculating, but not unkind, studied her face. You worked in Riyadh? He asked, switching back to Arabic. Yes, sir. Al Fahad and Associates. 4 years. He tilted his head slightly, the gesture both acknowledgement and assessment. You're not just housekeeping. Griffin's throat tightened. No, sir, but it's what pays the bills for my kids right now. Something shifted in Al Rostamani's expression, so subtle it might have been a trick of the light. Your children, what are their names? Nova JC and Hayes JC. He nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if filing the information away in some mental ledger where important things were kept. Then he turned to Romy Dean, who still stood statue still by the door. Clear my calendar for 3 o'clock. I want to speak with Miss Griffin privately. And then he was gone, leaving behind the faint scent of oud and the heavy silence of men whose egos had just been punctured. Griffin stood alone for a moment, the conference room suddenly feeling too large and too small at the same time. Her hands, which had been steady throughout the confrontation, now trembled. She grabbed the water tray muscle memory from months of invisible service and headed for the exit. The hallway stretched before her like a gauntlet. Junior analysts pressed themselves against the walls as she passed, their eyes wide, mouths slightly open. No one spoke. No one dared. The service elevator was at the far end, past the executive restrooms and the mahogany-paneled waiting area where clients sipped espresso from bone china cups. Griffin's uniform shoes, practical, rubber-soled, silent, made no sound on the marble floor, but she felt the weight of every step. What have I done? The thought arrived unbidden, accompanied by a cold rush of adrenaline that made her fingers tingle. She'd just spoken truth to power, yes, but power rarely rewarded truth-tellers. Power punished them, quietly, efficiently, with pink slips and blacklists and whispered warnings that followed you from firm to firm until even the McDonald's down the street stopped returning your calls. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding. Griffin stepped inside and pressed the button for the basement level, where the staff locker rooms were. As the numbers descended 42, 41, 40, her shoulders finally sagged. She leaned against the elevator wall, closed her eyes, and forced herself to breathe. 1 breath in, 1 breath out. The technique her mother had taught her during panic attacks, back when Imani's mind was still sharp enough to remember her daughter's tells. Don't let them make you small, JC, her mother had said near the end, during one of the brief windows of clarity that punctuated the fog of Alzheimer's. You were made to take up space. The elevator lurched to a stop on the 15th floor. The doors opened. Inside stood Carmen Rodriguez, one of the other housekeepers, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and laugh lines, earned from raising 3 kids on wages that barely covered rent. Her eyes widened when she saw Griffin. Girl, Carmen breathed, stepping inside. What did you do up there? Half the kitchen's buzzing. They're saying you called out Mr. Al Rostamani in front of the whole board. Griffin gave a tight smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. I might have said a little too much. Carmen tilted her head, studying her. Too much? Or just enough? I don't know yet, Griffin admitted, as the elevator resumed its descent. The numbers blinked past. 14, 13, 12. Maybe both. They rode in silence for a moment, the mechanical hum of the elevator filling the space where words should have been. Then Carmen reached out and touched Griffin's arm gently, the gesture so full of quiet solidarity that Griffin's eyes burned. "You did what you had to," Carmen said softly. "You looked out for them, even if they didn't know they needed it." Griffin nodded, not trusting her voice. She wanted to believe that. God, she wanted to believe that her interruption had been brave rather than reckless, principled rather than career-ending. But reality was more complicated than moral clarity. Reality was a single mother with 2 kids, a resume gap that screamed unreliable, and a housekeeping job that barely kept them afloat, but at least kept them alive. The elevator doors opened onto the basement level. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in harsh, unflattering relief. The hallway smelled like industrial cleaner and old coffee. Griffin's world. "Good luck," Carmen whispered as Griffin stepped out. "You're gonna need it." When Griffin pushed open the door to the employee locker room, she found her supervisor already waiting. Mr. Dennis Jenkins stood with his arms crossed, his face red and shining with sweat. He was a middle-aged man who'd been with the hotel for 20 years and had perfected the art of being simultaneously obsequious to management and tyrannical to staff. Right now, he looked like he'd been sweating bullets for the past 20 minutes. "You're on thin ice, Griffin," he said without preamble. "No greeting. No chance to explain. I've already gotten 3 calls from upper management. 3. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Griffin set her tray down on the bench beside her locker. Her hands had stopped shaking, replaced by a cold, steady calm that surprised her. "I overheard something dangerous during the meeting," she said, her voice even. "I spoke up. That's what I did." "You spoke out of turn." Jenkins began pacing, his shoes squeaking on the linoleum. "That was a multi-billion-dollar negotiation. Do you understand that? Multi-billion. And you, he gestured at her uniform, at her name tag, at everything she represented. "You embarrassed them. You embarrassed this hotel. You embarrassed me. No." Griffin's voice cut through his tirade like a blade. "I protected them from signing away their right to a man who was manipulating contract language to serve his own interests. If embarrassment is the price of preventing corporate fraud, then I'll pay it." Jenkins stopped pacing. He stared at her, mouth slightly open, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. "Be that as it may, Griffin," he finally managed, his voice dropping to something that might have been meant to sound reasonable, but came across as condescending. "You can't just—" "She stays." Both of them turned. Standing in the doorway was Veronica Ellison, the hotel's general manager. She was a tall woman in her late 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a sleek bun, and the kind of commanding presence that made even CEOs sit up straighter. She was rarely seen outside her corner office on the 31st floor, emerging only for crises or triumphs. Her sudden appearance in the basement-level locker room felt almost surreal. She stepped into the room like a judge descending into court, her heels clicking purposefully on the floor. "Miss Griffin showed more insight in 5 minutes than some of our contracted legal consultants have shown in 5 months. Veronica continued, her gaze fixed on Jenkins. "She will not be punished for that." Jenkins sputtered, his face cycling through shades of red. "But the protocol, the chain of command—" "The protocol," Veronica interrupted smoothly, "doesn't account for employees who save us from multi-million-dollar disasters. I'll handle this, Mr. Jenkins. You're dismissed." It wasn't a suggestion. Jenkins opened his mouth, closed it, then turned and left without another word. The door swung shut behind him, leaving Griffin alone with the woman who held her employment, her livelihood, her children's future in her hands. Veronica's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "You're off floor duties for the rest of the day," she said. "Come to my office at 3 o'clock. Griffin nodded slowly, her mind racing. "Yes, ma'am." Veronica studied her for a moment longer, something unreadable in her eyes. Then she turned and walked away without another word, leaving Griffin standing in the harsh fluorescent light of the locker room, wondering if she'd just been saved, or if this was merely a more elegant form of execution. Griffin stood alone in the locker room for a long moment after Veronica left. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like trapped insects. The industrial smell of bleach and floor wax filled her lungs. This was her world now, had been for 3 years. But it hadn't always been. She pulled out her phone with trembling fingers and dialed Mrs. Chen, her neighbor who watched Nova and Hayes after school. "Hello, Mrs. Chen's warm voice came through, accompanied by the sound of children laughing in the background. "Hi, Mrs. Chen. It's JC. I might be a little late picking up the kids today." "Oh, no problem, honey. They're having snacks now." Nova's helping Hayes with his spelling words. A pause. "Is everything okay? You sound stressed." Griffin closed her eyes. In the background, she could hear Nova's voice, patient, gentle. So much like Imani's had been helping her little brother sound out words. "No, Hayes, it's friend. F-R-I-E-N-D. Try again." Tears pricked Griffin's eyes. "Everything's fine, Mrs. Chen. I just had an important meeting today." "A meeting? But I thought you were—" Mrs. Chen caught herself, too polite to finish the sentence. "I thought you were just housekeeping." "I am," Griffin said quietly. "But maybe not for much longer." After she hung up, Griffin sank onto the bench beside her locker. Her reflection stared back at her from the small mirror, taped inside the door, a woman in a maid's uniform, name tag slightly askew, hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. But for just a moment, she let herself remember the woman she used to be. 4 years earlier. Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. The memory came flooding back with crystalline clarity, standing in a glass-walled office overlooking the desert, wearing a tailored suit that actually fit, reviewing merger documents in Arabic and English, while her colleagues, men twice her age, with half her education, sought her opinion on compliance issues. She'd been respected then, valued, seen, and then the phone call. Her neighbor in New York, voice shaking. "JC, it's your mother." She wandered outside in her nightgown. She couldn't remember her address. I think you need to come home." Griffin opened her eyes, the memory dissolving like smoke. That phone call had changed everything. She'd left Riyadh within the week, abandoning the career she'd built, the respect she'd earned, the life she'd fought so hard to create. Because her mother, brilliant, fierce, uncompromising Imani Turner, needed her. And family came first. Always. The 3 years that followed had been a slow erosion, caring for a woman who forgot her daughter's name, watching a sharp legal mind dissolve into confusion and fear, sitting beside a hospital bed as Alzheimer's claimed the last fragments of the person her mother had been. And then, the aftermath, the empty apartment, the unpaid medical bills, the resume with a 3-year gap that screamed liability to every recruiter who glanced at it, the rejection emails that piled up like snow. "Thank you for your interest. And we've decided to move forward with other candidates." Until she'd stopped applying for legal positions altogether and started applying for anything that would pay. Retail, data entry, cleaning services. The Empire Grand Hotel had hired her without hesitation. They needed bodies. She needed income. It was transactional, simple, soul-crushing, but simple. Griffin glanced at her watch. 2:47 p.m. She had 8 minutes to pull herself together, change into something that wasn't a uniform, and present herself at Veronica Ellison's office. "What you did took courage," Veronica had said. "That kind of courage doesn't go unnoticed." Griffin stood, straightened her spine, and opened her locker. Hanging inside was the only professional outfit she still owned, a charcoal blazer, slightly faded at the elbows, and a pair of black slacks she'd bought at a thrift store in Queens. They didn't fit quite right anymore. She'd lost weight during those final months with her mother, but they would have to. She changed quickly, mechanically, her mind already racing ahead to the meeting. What would Veronica say? Would this be a gentle termination, a warning, or, and she barely let herself consider this an opportunity. As she smoothed down the blazer and checked her reflection one last time, Griffin thought of her mother's last coherent words. "Don't let them make you small, JC. You were made to take up space." "Okay, Mama," she whispered to her reflection. "Let's see if I still know how." And with that, JC Griffin left the basement locker room and headed for the elevator that would take her up far up to the 31st floor, where her future waited behind a mahogany door. The service elevator descended in mechanical silence, but Griffin's pulse roared like a freight train in her ears. She pressed herself against the back wall, still clutching the empty water tray like a shield. The numbers above the doors blinked down 42, 41, 40 each floor, bringing her closer to the basement level where she belonged, where the invisible people worked, where women like her kept their heads down and their mouths shut and survived by being useful but never, ever noticed. Except she'd just been noticed. By everyone. Griffin's hands trembled. She set the tray on the elevator's corner shelf before it clattered to the floor and betrayed just how badly she was shaking. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished steel doors. A woman in a pressed black uniform with white trim, name tag slightly crooked now, hair still pulled back in the tight ponytail that made her invisible. But her eyes looked different, wider, startled, like she'd just woken from a dream and wasn't sure which version of reality was real. What have I done? The elevator lurched to a stop on the 28th floor. Griffin's breath caught. The door slid open. 3 junior analysts stood waiting, young men in slim-cut suits, probably fresh out of Wharton or Columbia, the kind who ordered lattes with oat milk and never looked at the people who delivered them. They saw Griffin and froze. One of them, a blonde with wire-rimmed glasses, opened his mouth, then closed it. They exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them that Griffin couldn't decode. Then they stepped aside. Not into the elevator. They just moved, pressed themselves against the hallway walls like she was radioactive, or royalty. Griffin wasn't sure which. "Sorry," she said reflexively, old instincts kicking in. "I can wait if you need to." "No, ma'am," the blonde one said quickly. Too quickly. "We'll catch the next one." "Ma'am." He'd called her ma'am. The doors slid shut before Griffin could process that. The elevator resumed its descent, and Griffin sagged against the wall, her knees suddenly weak. "They're scared of me," she realized. "Or scared of what I represent, scared of what I know." The thought should have felt empowering. Instead, it felt dangerous. The elevator stopped again on the 15th floor. This time, when the doors opened, Griffin exhaled in relief. Carmen Rodriguez stood waiting, her own service cart beside her stacked with fresh linens and miniature shampoo bottles. Carmen was 52, round-faced and kind-eyed, with streaks of grey in her dark hair that she'd stopped trying to cover years ago. She'd worked at the Empire Grand for 15 years, raised 3 kids on housekeeping wages, and had perfected the art of being friendly without being familiar, a survival skill in a place where the staff were expected to be seen, but not heard. Her eyes went wide when she saw Griffin. "Dios mío," Carmen breathed, stepping into the elevator. She jabbed the button for the basement level, then turned to Griffin with an expression caught between awe and alarm. "Girl, what did you do up there?" Griffin opened her mouth. "I closed it. I opened it again. I spoke up." "Spoke up?" Carmen's voice rose, half an octave. "Half the kitchen's buzzing. They're saying you interrupted Mr. Al-Rostamani in the middle of negotiations. That you spoke Arabic to him. That you—" She paused, searching Griffin's face. "Is it true? Did you really call him out in front of everyone?" Griffin's throat felt tight. "I might have said a little too much." The elevator descended past the 14th floor, the 13th, the 12th. Carmen tilted her head, studying Griffin with the same careful attention she gave to stubborn stains. "Too much?" she asked softly. "Or just enough?" Griffin's breath hitched. She looked down at her hands that had spent the last 3 years scrubbing toilets, changing sheets, refilling water carafes for people who never saw her. Hands that had once held briefing documents for international mergers, that had signed contracts worth millions. "I don't know yet," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe both." They rode in silence for a long moment, the mechanical hum of the elevator filling the space where words should have been. The numbers blinked past. 11, 10, 9. Griffin counted them like a countdown to something she couldn't name. Impact. Explosion. Consequences. Then Carmen reached out and touched Griffin's arm, her hand warm and solid. The gesture was so full of quiet solidarity that Griffin's eyes burned. "You did what you had to," Carmen said softly. "You looked out for them, even if they didn't know they needed it. That's cojones, mija. That's real courage." Griffin nodded, not trusting her voice. She wanted to believe that. Wanted to believe that her interruption had been principled rather than reckless, brave rather than career-ending. But doubt crept in like cold water seeping through cracks. Because courage didn't pay the rent. Courage didn't put food on the table for Nova and Hayes. Courage didn't explain to an 8-year-old why they might have to move again, change schools again, start over again. The elevator doors opened onto the basement level with a soft ding that sounded almost apologetic. "Good luck," Carmen whispered, as Griffin stepped out. "You're gonna need it." The employee locker room smelled like industrial cleaner and old coffee. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in harsh, unflattering relief. Griffin pushed through the door and stopped short. Mr. Dennis Jenkins stood in the center of the room, arms crossed over his chest, his face red and shining with sweat. He was a middle-aged man who'd been with the hotel for 20 years and had perfected the art of being simultaneously obsequious to management and tyrannical to staff. His tie was loosened, his collar damp. He looked like he'd been pacing for the last 20 minutes, working himself into a fury. "You're on thin ice, Griffin," he said without preamble. No greeting, no chance to explain. His voice echoed off the metal lockers. "I've already gotten 3 calls from upper management." 3. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Griffin set her empty water tray down on the bench beside her locker. Her hands had stopped trembling, replaced by a cold, steady calm that surprised her. "I overheard something dangerous during the meeting," she said, her voice even. "I spoke up. That's what I did." "You spoke out of turn." Jenkins began pacing, his shoes squeaking on the linoleum floor. His hands gesticulated wildly, punctuating each word. "That was a multi-billion-dollar negotiation. Do you understand that? Multi-billion. With one of the wealthiest men in the Middle East. And you—" He gestured at her uniform, at her name tag, at everything she represented. "You embarrassed them. You embarrassed this hotel. You embarrassed me." The fluorescent lights buzzed louder, or maybe it was just the blood rushing in Griffin's ears. She thought of Nova and Hayes, probably sitting at Mrs. Chen's kitchen table right now doing homework, completely unaware that their mother had just detonated her career. She thought of the overdue electric bill sitting on her kitchen counter, the pediatrician appointment Hayes needed that she couldn't afford, the leak under the bathroom sink she'd been ignoring for 2 months. But she also thought of Sean Gregory and the other American executives, seconds away from signing a contract that would have stripped them of control over their own company. Thought of Dylan Wade, the translator, sweating through his shirt because he knew Griffin was right and he'd been complicit in the deception. "No." Griffin's voice cut through Jenkins' tirade like a blade. "I protected them from signing away their rights to a man who was manipulating contract language to serve his own interests. If embarrassment is the price of preventing corporate fraud, then I'll pay it." Jenkins stopped pacing. He stared at her, mouth slightly open, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. Behind him, Griffin could see her reflection in the mirror over the sinks, a woman in a maid's uniform, standing straight-backed, meeting her supervisor's gaze with steady eyes. "Don't let them make you small, JC," her mother's voice, clear as crystal in her memory. "Be that as it may, Griffin," Jenkins finally managed, his voice dropping to something that might have been meant to sound reasonable, but came across as condescending. "You can't just—" "She stays." Both of them turned. Standing in the doorway was Veronica Ellison. Griffin had seen the hotel's general manager from a distance dozens of times, a tall woman in her late 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a sleek chignon, always dressed in impeccably tailored suits that whispered money and power. She was rarely seen outside her corner office on the 31st floor, emerging only for VIP arrivals or major crises. Her sudden appearance in the basement-level locker room felt almost surreal, like seeing a lion strolling through a petting zoo. She stepped into the room, her heels clicking purposefully on the linoleum. The sound seemed to fill every corner of the small space. "Miss Griffin showed more insight in 5 minutes than some of our contracted legal consultants have shown in 5 months, Veronica continued, her gaze fixed on Jenkins with laser precision. "She will not be punished for that," Jenkins sputtered, his face cycling through shades of red. But the protocol, the chain of command." "The protocol," Veronica interrupted smoothly, her voice carrying the kind of authority that brooked no argument, "doesn't account for employees who save us from multi-million-dollar disasters. I'll handle this, Mr. Jenkins. You're dismissed. It wasn't a suggestion. Jenkins opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again like a fish gasping for air. Finally, he turned and left without another word, his shoulders hunched, his earlier fury deflated into something that looked like humiliation. The door swung shut behind him with a soft thud. Griffin stood frozen, suddenly very aware of her rumpled uniform, her crooked name tag, the faint scent of floor cleaner that clung to her skin. Veronica Ellison studied her with eyes that seemed to see everything, not just the surface, but the layers beneath. The exhaustion, the fear, the flickering hope that refused to die. "You're off floor duties for the rest of the day," Veronica said, her tone softer now but no less commanding. "Come to my office at 3 o'clock. Griffin's voice came out smaller than she intended. "Yes, ma'am." Veronica studied her for a moment longer, something unreadable flickering across her face. "What you did took courage, Miss Griffin. That kind of courage doesn't go unnoticed." Then she turned and walked away, her heels clicking down the hallway until the sound faded into silence. Griffin stood alone in the locker room, her heart pounding. Carmen appeared in the doorway moments later, eyes wide. "Mia," she breathed, stepping inside and grabbing Griffin's hand. Her fingers were warm, calloused from years of work. "Do you know what this means?" Griffin shook her head, not trusting her voice. "It means you've got a shot," Carmen said, squeezing her hand. "A real shot. Don't waste it." Griffin's hands shook as she pulled out her phone. The screen showed 2:23 p.m. She had 37 minutes before she needed to be at Veronica Ellison's office. 37 minutes to pull herself together, to figure out what to say, to prepare for whatever came next. But first, she needed to hear her children's voices. She dialed Mrs. Chen, her neighbor who watched Nova and Hayes after school for a rate so low it was basically charity. The phone rang twice before Mrs. Chen's warm, slightly accented voice came through. "Hello?" "Hi, Mrs. Chen. It's JC. I might be a little late picking up the kids today." "Oh, no problem, honey. They're having snacks now." In the background, Griffin could hear the unmistakable sound of children laughing, Nova's bright giggle and Hayes's deeper chuckle. Nova's helping Hayes with his spelling words. "Hold on." Mrs. Chen's voice became muffled, then clearer. "Nova, it's your mom." "Hi, Mommy." Nova's voice burst through the phone, full of the uncomplicated joy that only 8-year-olds possessed. "When are you coming home?" Hayes made a fort out of couch cushions, and Mrs. Chen says, "We can have cookies if we finish our homework." Tears pricked Griffin's eyes. She pressed her free hand against her mouth, fighting to keep her voice steady. "That's wonderful, baby. I'll be there as soon as I can, okay? Be good for Mrs. Chen." "Okay. Love you, Mommy." "Love you too, sweetheart." Mrs. Chen came back on the line. "Is everything okay, JC? You sound stressed." Griffin closed her eyes. Behind her eyelids, she could see Nova's face so much like Imani's had been at that age, all curiosity and determination. Could see Hayes's gap-toothed grin, the way he looked at her like she could solve any problem in the world. What if I lose this job? The thought crashed through her like a wave. What if speaking up costs us everything? But another thought followed, quieter but insistent. What if this changes everything? "Everything's fine, Mrs. Chen," Griffin said softly. "I just had an important meeting today." "A meeting?" Mrs. Chen's surprise was evident. "But I thought you were—" She caught herself, too polite to finish the sentence. "I thought you were just housekeeping." "I am," Griffin said. "But maybe not for much longer." After she hung up, Griffin sank onto the bench beside her locker. Her reflection stared back at her from the small mirror taped inside the door, a woman in a maid's uniform, name tag askew, hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. But her eyes looked different. Alive, awake, afraid. She had 29 minutes now. 29 minutes to change into something that wasn't a uniform, to wash her face, to become the woman she used to be, or at least remember how to pretend. Griffin stood, squared her shoulders, and reached for her locker. Inside hung the only professional outfit she still owned, a charcoal blazer with faded elbows and black slacks she'd bought at a thrift store in Queens. They didn't fit quite right anymore. She'd lost weight during those final months with her mother, but they would have to. As she changed, her hands steadier now, Griffin thought of her mother's last coherent words, spoken on a Tuesday afternoon when the fog lifted just long enough for Imani to see her daughter clearly. "Don't let them make you small, JC. You were made to take up space." "Okay, Mama," Griffin whispered to her reflection. "Let's see if I still know how." She smoothed down the blazer, adjusted the collar, and headed for the elevator that would take her up far up to the 31st floor, where her future waited behind a mahogany door. At 2:55 p.m., Griffin stood outside Veronica Ellison's office on the 31st floor, palms slick with sweat. She'd changed out of her uniform in the basement locker room, trading polyester for the only professional outfit she still owned, a charcoal blazer with faded elbows and black slacks that had seen better years. In the fluorescent light of the women's restroom, she'd smoothed the fabric over and over, suddenly aware of how worn it all looked. The blazer hung differently than it used to. Looser in some places, tighter in others. A garment from another life. Now, standing in the carpeted corridor where executives moved with purposeful stride, Griffin felt the weight of every eye that didn't meet hers. A woman in Prada heels clicked past without a glance. A man in a three-piece suit studied his phone as if she didn't exist. The clock above the reception desk ticked toward 3. She took a deep breath and knocked. "Come in." The office was a study in minimalist elegance. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Hudson, the afternoon light casting long shadows across blonde wood floors. A glass desk sat center stage, so clean it barely seemed real. Behind it, framed awards lined the walls, accolades from legal journals, commendations from international arbitration boards. But Griffin's eyes caught on a single photograph. Veronica Ellison, decades younger, shaking hands with President Carter. The colors had that faded quality of the 1,970 seconds. "Sit." Griffin sank into the chair across from Veronica, who studied her with the same intensity she'd shown in the conference room. But here, in this private space, something else flickered beneath the scrutiny. Curiosity, maybe? Or calculation. "You worked in Abu Dhabi," Veronica said. "Not a question." "Yes." "Why did you leave?" Griffin's throat tightened. This was the question that ended every interview, every conversation that came close to mattering. "My mother got sick. Early onset Alzheimer's. I came home to care for her." Veronica's expression didn't change, but she leaned forward slightly. "After she passed," Griffin continued, the words coming slower now, "I tried to return to law, but the gap became insurmountable. Firms don't trust gaps. They see commitment issues." She paused, meeting Veronica's gaze. "Or worse, they see a single black mother with 2 kids and assume I'm a risk." The silence stretched between them. Outside, a ferry cut across the water, leaving a white wake. Veronica nodded once. "That's the world. But today, you made the right people notice." She turned to her computer, fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. "I looked you up," she said, angling the monitor so Griffin could see. "National Sovereign Fund. Internal Risk Review Division. 3 years overseeing compliance for contracts over $100 million. Stellar performance reviews." She scrolled down. Then, nothing. Griffin stared at her own history rendered in bullet points, the sharp drop-off where her life had fractured. "You could have walked away today," Veronica said, her voice measured. "Let them sign. Let them fall. It wasn't your problem anymore." "I couldn't," Griffin said quietly. "I knew what that clause meant. Moral clarity." Veronica leaned back in her chair, studying Griffin like she was a contract to be passed. "It's rare, especially when you have nothing to gain from it." Griffin said nothing. What was there to say? That she'd acted on instinct? That she'd seen the trap and couldn't watch them walk into it, even if it meant risking the fragile invisibility that kept her employed? "You want back in?" Veronica asked. Griffin blinked. "Back in? The real world. The table. You've still got the mind, the spine. What you lack is opportunity." Veronica stood, moving to the bookshelf behind her desk. "Let's change that." "I haven't touched a legal document in years," Griffin said, her voice catching on the admission. "That didn't stop you from saving a deal." Veronica pulled a thick binder from the shelf, easily 300 pages, tabs protruding from the edges like flags. She set it on the desk between them with a solid thunk. Draft contract? Merger between two pharmaceutical companies. Annotated, complex, and riddled with problems. Show me where they are. You have 24 hours. Griffin stared at the binder, her hands trembling as she reached for it. It felt impossibly heavy, like holding proof that the last 5 years could be undone. Or at least acknowledged. Why? She whispered. Because what you did took courage, Veronica said, walking Griffin to the door. And that kind of courage doesn't go unnoticed. Not by me. Griffin clutched the binder like a life raft, like something that might finally keep her afloat. As she stepped into the hallway, Veronica's voice followed her. Don't disappoint me, Miss Cole. Griffin turned back, but the door was already closing. Through the narrowing gap, she caught one last glimpse of Veronica at her desk, already back at her computer, already moving on to the next thing. But Griffin stood there in the hallway for a long moment, the binder pressed against her chest, feeling something she hadn't felt in years. Hope, tentative, fragile, but undeniably alive. Griffin's one-bedroom apartment in Queens felt smaller than usual, the kitchen table buried under spread pages of contract clauses, sticky notes, and cold coffee. She'd arrived home just past 7, the binder under her arm and exhaustion pressing against her shoulders. Before she could set her bag down, Nova and Hayes came running, a blur of braids and gap-toothed smiles that nearly knocked her backward. "Mommy!" Hayes launched himself at her legs. Mrs. Chen appeared from the living room, wiping her hands on her apron. "They've been asking about you all day," she said, her accent soft around the edges. "I told them you'd be home soon." "Thank you," Griffin said, pulling both children close. The guilt came swift and familiar, settling in her chest like a stone. She breathed in the scent of their shampoo, felt Hayes's sticky fingers clutch her blazer. She made them dinner mac and cheese from a box, carrot sticks that Hayes pushed around his plate without eating. Nova sat across from her, studying Griffin's face with the intensity of someone twice her age. "Why are you home late?" Nova asked. Griffin set down her fork. "Mommy had an important meeting today." "Are you in trouble?" Hayes's eyes went wide, worried. Griffin paused, searching for the right words. "No, baby. I think something good might be happening." She moved through the evening rituals on autopilot: bath time, pajamas, bedtime stories. Hayes fell asleep halfway through Where the Wild Things Are, his breathing evening out against her arm. Nova stayed awake longer, watching Griffin with those dark, knowing eyes. "I'm proud of you, Mommy," she whispered. Griffin's throat tightened. She kissed Nova's forehead, smoothed back her braids, and stood in the doorway for a long moment after turning off the light. Proud. The word echoed in the quiet. At 9 o'clock, Griffin spread the contract across the kitchen table. She brewed a pot of tea using her mother's ceramic teapot, blue and white porcelain, one of the few belongings she'd kept after the estate sale. The radiator clanged in protest against the November cold. The overhead light flickered once, twice, then steadied. Griffin opened the binder and began to read. Clause by clause, line by line. Her highlighter moved across the pages in steady strokes: yellow for concerns, pink for critical issues, green for questions that needed clarification. Sticky notes bloomed along the margins like colorful flags marking dangerous territory. First flag. Section 4.7, subsection 3. Contingent override based on regulatory realignment. She scribbled on her legal pad. Requires clear definition. Who defines realignment? Current language allows unilateral interpretation. Suggest amendment with jurisdiction specificity and third-party arbitration clause. Second flag. Section 8.2, Intellectual Property Licensing. Licensor grants exclusive rights in perpetuity as long as operational sustainability criteria are met. Her pen moved faster now, muscle memory returning. Who defines sustainability? Perpetuity gives unchecked power to licensor. Recommend limiting to 5-year terms with annual performance review. Include exit provisions. Third flag. Asset transfer provisions buried in Appendix C, easy to miss if you weren't looking. The language allowed Al Rostamani Holdings to reclaim underperforming assets without establishing clear metrics for what constituted underperformance. Define underperformance with quantifiable benchmarks, she wrote. Establish independent audit requirement. protect acquiring party from arbitrary seizure. The apartment settled into silence around her. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance. A neighbor's television murmured through the thin walls. Griffin barely noticed. She was back in it now, the precision, the hunt for vulnerability, the satisfaction of finding what others had missed. At midnight, she took a break. Her back ached from hunching over the table. She stood at the window, looking out at the city lights scattered across the darkness like scattered diamonds. From here, she could just make out the Manhattan skyline, towers glowing against the night sky. She remembered working in Abu Dhabi, a glass office overlooking the desert, the way the sun turned the sand to gold at dawn. Colleagues who respected her expertise, challenged her thinking, pushed her to be sharper. Challenging work that made her feel alive, a thriving career that promised everything. Then, the phone call from her neighbor in New York. Your mother wandered outside in her nightgown. She couldn't remember her own address. She kept asking for someone named James. I don't think she knows who I am anymore. The decision to leave hadn't been a choice. It had been necessity, immediate and absolute. She'd booked the next flight, packed what mattered, and left behind the career she'd spent a decade building. Grief moved through her now like a tide, her mother's laugh, sharp and sudden. Her mother's mind, brilliant until it wasn't. The slow deterioration, the moments of clarity that hurt worse than the confusion. Her mother's last words, spoken in a rare moment of lucidity. Don't let them make you small, JC. Griffin pressed her forehead against the cold glass. She went back to the table. By 2 a.m., she'd finished. 10 sections flagged with detailed notes and recommended revisions. 5 cultural misinterpretation risks that could escalate into litigation. 3 potential legal overreach scenarios that would leave Barrett vulnerable to breach of contract claims. She stacked the pages carefully, placed them back in the binder with her notes paper-clipped to the relevant sections. Her handwriting covered the legal pad in neat rows, precise, thorough, irrefutable. Griffin looked at the photo stuck to the fridge with a magnet. Nova and Hayes at the park last summer, grinning at the camera with ice cream smeared on their faces. The sun had caught them just right, making them glow. This is for you, she whispered. She set her alarm for 6 a.m., stumbled into bed still wearing her clothes, and collapsed into sleep so deep it felt like falling. Al Rostamani's private office occupied the entire western corner of the 50th floor, where floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city like a kingdom awaiting conquest. At 3 o'clock, Griffin arrived with the binder clutched against her chest, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. Romy Dean, Al Rostamani's personal assistant, greeted her with cool efficiency, a woman in her 40s with perfect posture and a gaze that assessed Griffin in seconds. Mr. Al Rostamani is expecting you, she said, gesturing toward the inner office. Griffin walked through the outer office where assistants typed with practiced speed and phones rang in overlapping rhythms. The space hummed with controlled energy, every person moving with purpose. Then Romy opened the heavy mahogany door, and Griffin stepped into silence. The office was a study in restraint. White marble floors gleamed beneath her feet. A single orchid sat on the glass desk, its white petals stark against the minimalist backdrop. But it was the photographs that caught Griffin's attention, Al Rostamani with heads of state, their handshakes frozen in time. Al Rostamani with 3 young women who shared his features. Mariam, Futaim, Shamsa, she guessed, and one larger frame showing him with a woman in an emerald gown at what looked like a charity gala, both of them smiling with genuine warmth. Sit. Griffin lowered herself into the chair across from him, placing the binder carefully on her lap. Al Rostamani leaned back, studying her with the same intensity he'd shown in the conference room yesterday. But here, without an audience, something in his expression had softened. Not kindness exactly, but curiosity. You saved them from a bad deal, he said finally. And you did it knowing it could cost you your job. Why? Griffin met his gaze, finding steadiness in the directness of the question. Because I've spent too many years watching people get taken advantage of, because they didn't understand the language literally or figuratively. I couldn't stand by and let it happen when I had the knowledge to stop it. Al Rostamani nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd already suspected. I looked into your background, Al Fahad and Associates. 4 years, stellar record, then nothing. A gap of 3 years. Griffin's throat tightened. Caring for my mother. And after she passed? I tried to return to law, but firms don't trust gaps. They see liability instead of loyalty. She paused, the familiar bitterness rising. No one wants to hear that you chose family over career. They just see someone who couldn't handle both. The silence stretched between them. Outside, a helicopter passed, its shadow sweeping across the windows. What did you find? Al Rostamani gestured toward the binder. Griffin opened it to the first flagged section, her hands steadier now. This part she knew. This part made sense. Section 4.7. She began, walking him through each issue systematically. The override clauses are disguised as flexibility, but they're actually unilateral decision-making authority without accountability. Section 8.2. The IP rights in perpetuity sound generous, but without defined metrics for operational sustainability. They give you unchecked control to revoke licensing at will. Al Rostamani leaned forward, pulling reading glasses from his breast pocket. She continued, turning pages with growing confidence. The asset reclamation language in Appendix C would allow you to seize underperforming assets without clear benchmarks. And throughout, she gestured at the sticky notes bristling from the pages. There are cultural misinterpretations between American and Gulf legal traditions that could escalate into litigation. The language assumes good faith, but it doesn't establish mechanisms to enforce it. Al Rostamani reviewed a specific clause she'd flagged, his lips pursing slightly. After a long moment, he removed his glasses and looked at her. You're right, he said quietly. This would have given us unchecked authority. Barrett would have signed away protection without realizing it. He paused. That's why you spoke up? Yes. The word hung in the air between them. Griffin felt the weight of it, not just the admission, but everything it represented. The risk she'd taken, the gap she'd tried to bridge, the hope she'd been afraid to name. Al Rostamani opened a desk drawer and pulled out a leather portfolio. He slid it across the glass surface toward her. I'm offering you a position. Legal consultant for our American operations. Griffin's hands trembled as she stared at the portfolio. I don't understand. You'll review contracts, sit in on negotiations, advise on cross-cultural legal nuances. Starting salary is $180,000 with performance bonuses, full benefits, flexible hours so you can be there for Nova and Hayes. The room tilted. Griffin gripped the edge of the desk, certain she'd misheard. You don't know me. I know enough. Al Rostamani's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes, recognition, perhaps, or respect. You spoke when it mattered. That's more valuable than any degree. He opened the portfolio. Inside lay a contract, clean pages, clearly formatted, no hidden clauses buried in appendices. Griffin's vision blurred as tears gathered at the corners of her eyes. Why? Her voice came out barely above a whisper. Al Rostamani smiled faintly, the first genuine warmth she'd seen from him. Because my wife Manal once told me, power without accountability is just cruelty with a nicer office. You held me accountable today. That deserves respect. Griffin looked down at the contract, at the numbers that would change everything, the apartment in Queens, the worn blazer, the fear that woke her at 3 a.m. wondering how she'd make rent. Thank you, she managed. Don't thank me yet. Al Rostamani stood, extending his hand. This world will test you, but if you can survive what you've already endured and still stand up for what's right, you'll thrive. Griffin rose, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, steady, a promise sealed with pressure. As she walked out of his office, contract portfolio under her arm, she caught Romy Dean watching her with something that might have been approval. The assistants kept typing. The phones kept ringing. But Griffin moved through it all in a daze, feeling like she'd stepped through a door into a life she'd thought was lost forever. Griffin's first day as legal consultant began with a nameplate on a door, but the room behind it felt more like a battlefield than an office. Monday morning, 8 o'clock. Griffin arrived wearing a new suit, purchased with part of her signing bonus, navy blue, with clean lines that fit properly for the first time in years. Her heels clicked against the marble floors as she made her way to the 45th floor, heart racing with a mixture of excitement and terror. The office was modest, but professional. A solid desk, a new computer already set up with her credentials, law books lining a shelf she hadn't expected, and a window that overlooked the city in a way that made her feel like she'd been granted access to something previously forbidden. But it was the nameplate that stopped her. J.C. Griffin, legal consultant. She touched it with trembling fingers, tracing the letters engraved in brass. Real, tangible, proof. Inside, she'd barely set down her bag when Romy Dean appeared in the doorway with a tablet and an expression of brisk efficiency. Morning briefing at 9, contract review at 11, lunch with Mr. Al-Rostamani at 1. She glanced up. Don't be late. Griffin's stomach flipped. I won't. The conference room felt colder than it had during the Barrett meeting. Griffin entered at 8:58 a.m., clutching her notepad and pen like armor. Sean Gregory sat at the head of the table, Colton Avery to his right. 3 other executives she didn't recognize filled the remaining seats. No one looked up when she entered. No one made eye contact. She took a seat near the middle, setting her notepad down carefully. Sean finally acknowledged her presence with a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. So you're our new consultant. The pause before consultant dripped with condescension, turning the title into something diminished. I'm here to ensure clarity and fairness in cross-border agreements, Griffin said evenly. Colton muttered into his coffee. We've managed fine without a consultant. The meeting began. They were reviewing a new partnership proposal with a Singapore firm, a tech collaboration worth $40 million. Griffin listened intently, taking notes as they discussed timelines, deliverables, and revenue sharing. The language was familiar, the structure sound, until she reached Section 12. She raised her hand. Several seconds passed before Sean acknowledged her with an impatient nod. This clause, Griffin said, pointing to the projection on the screen, the intellectual property transfer language allows the Singapore entity to sublicense without your approval. Sean waved dismissively. That's standard licensing language. In American law, yes, Griffin continued, keeping her voice calm and professional. But under Singapore's Intellectual Property Act of 2021, sublicense includes derivative works. They could create competing products using your IP, and you'd have no recourse to stop them. The room went quiet. One of the executives she didn't know leaned forward, scanning the document on his tablet. Colton's expression shifted from dismissive to thoughtful. She might have a point, he said begrudgingly. Sean's jaw tightened. He made a note on his paper with more force than necessary. We'll have our legal team review it. I am your legal team, Griffin said quietly. The meeting continued, but the dynamic had shifted fractionally but noticeably. By the time it ended, 2 executives nodded at her as they left. Sean and Colton did not. After the meeting, Griffin headed to the restroom on the 45th floor. She was reaching for the door when she heard voices from around the corner, 2 women speaking in hushed tones that carried in the empty hallway. She's a diversity hire. Al-Rostamani felt guilty. Griffin froze, her hand suspended inches from the door handle. She was a maid last week. The other voice said Sean's assistant. Griffin realized with a sinking feeling. Now she's advising on billion-dollar deals. It's insulting to those of us who earned our positions. Give it a month. She'll be gone when he realizes his mistake. Laughter, quiet and cruel. Griffin stood frozen, her reflection visible in the polished metal of the door frame. The woman staring back at her looked professional, composed, successful. But underneath, she felt the old shame rising, the sense that she didn't belong, that she'd been allowed in by mistake, that at any moment someone would realize and send her back to where she came from. She took a deep breath, then another. When she finally pushed through the door and walked past them in the hallway, she kept her head high and her expression neutral. Neither woman had the grace to look ashamed. They simply stopped talking and watched her pass. But the words clung to her like smoke. The private dining room on the 50th floor was nothing like the cafeteria where she'd eaten lunch for the past 4 years. Al-Rostamani sat across from her at a table set with linen and silverware that gleamed under soft lighting. He noticed her tension immediately. How was your first morning? Griffin hesitated, choosing her words carefully. There's resistance. Of course there is. Al-Rostamani cut into his salmon with precision. You disrupted their hierarchy. They'll test you to see if you break. What if I can't handle it? He set down his fork and leaned forward, his expression serious. You stood in that conference room and challenged me in front of executives who've spent decades climbing corporate ladders. You can handle this. Before Griffin could respond, the door opened and a woman entered, elegant in a cream dress, her dark hair pulled back in a simple chignon. Manal al-Rostamani moved with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned her right to occupy space. "JC," Abdullah said, standing. "This is my wife, Manal." Manal's handshake was warm, her smile genuine. "Abdullah told me what you did. That took courage." They sat together over coffee, the conversation flowing naturally. Manal asked about Nova and Hayes, about Griffin's mother, about the years in Abu Dhabi and the difficult journey back. She listened with complete attention, asking questions that showed she genuinely cared about the answers. "This company needs people who prioritize truth over comfort," Manal said finally, stirring sugar into her tea. "It's easy to stay silent. It's harder to speak. Stay strong." Griffin felt something loosen in her chest, the tight knot of doubt that had formed after overhearing those women. Here, in this room with these people, she felt seen, validated, real. "Thank you," she said, meaning it completely. When she returned to her office that afternoon, someone had left a sticky note on her desk. "Going back to cleaning toilets yet?" Griffin stared at it for a long moment. Then she crumpled it and threw it in the trash. She had work to do. 3 weeks into her new role, Griffin accidentally uncovered something that made the initial contract dispute look like a parking ticket. It was 8 o'clock on a Thursday evening, the office silent except for the hum of the heating system and the occasional ping of elevator arrivals. Griffin sat alone at her desk, reviewing archived contracts for pattern analysis, a project al-Rostamani had assigned to identify recurring negotiation weaknesses. She was 3 hours into the work when she found it, a footnote buried in a contract amendment from 16 months ago, a single line referencing Legacy Holdings LLC as a strategic partner for deferred infrastructure development. Griffin frowned. She'd never heard the name mentioned in any meeting. She opened the internal database and searched. What appeared made her sit up straighter. A series of payments, $15 million over 18 months, dispersed in irregular increments ranging from $400,000 to $2.3 million. All labeled the same way. Strategic market expansion, deferred infrastructure. But there were no project details, no vendor contracts, no oversight documentation, no board approvals for expenditures over $1 million, which company policy required. And the payments were routed through a Cayman Islands subsidiary. Griffin's pulse quickened. She knew what red flags looked like. She began digging. Cross-referencing with publicly filed documents revealed that Legacy Holdings was registered in Delaware, a state notorious for corporate opacity, but its operational address was a P.O. box in Wilmington. No website, no business filings beyond the bare minimum required by law. The payment approvals were all signed by the same person, Sean Gregory. Griffin's fingers moved faster now, pulling up email archives. As legal consultant, she had access to company communications for review purposes. She typed Legacy Holdings into the search bar. 3 results. The first was from Sean, to an external consultant whose email address was registered to a generic Gmail account. Date: 14 months ago. Ensure funds remain off quarterly reports until infrastructure completion can be verified. Board doesn't need granular detail at this stage. The second email, sent 2 months later. Infrastructure delays provide cover for reallocation. Proceed as discussed. The third was a payment authorization form with Sean's digital signature and a note in the comment field. Per executive discretion, strategic initiative. Griffin's hands shook as she reread the messages. This wasn't negligence. This wasn't even creative accounting. This was embezzlement. $15 million funneled through a shell company, approved by a senior executive, deliberately kept off official reports. The infrastructure project, if it existed at all, was a cover story. She checked the clock. 10:30 p.m. She should wait. Should consult al-Rostamani in the morning when she could think clearly, when she could present the information properly. But a voice in the back of her mind whispered urgently, "If you're right, evidence could disappear." Griffin opened a new folder on her desktop and began documenting everything. Screenshots of the emails, saved as image files with timestamps. Financial records downloaded to an encrypted thumb drive she kept in her purse. A detailed timeline of payments cross-referenced with the dates of board meetings, showing clearly that none of these expenditures had been disclosed. She worked methodically, her legal training overriding her fear. Document everything. Create an unbreakable chain of evidence. Make it impossible to deny. The office lights flickered once, then steadied. Griffin froze, listening. Footsteps in the hallway. Deliberate. Unhurried. She quickly minimized the files and pulled up a standard partnership agreement, forcing her hands to stop trembling as she pretended to review contractual language. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The door opened. Colton Avery stood in the doorway, still wearing his suit jacket despite the late hour. His eyes swept the office, landing on her screen, then her face. "Working late?" he asked. Griffin forced her voice to remain steady. "Just catching up." He stepped inside, uninvited, and leaned against her desk. Too close. The movement felt deliberately invasive. "What are you working on?" "Partnership agreements for the Tokyo expansion." He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable, but something in his eyes suggested he didn't believe her. "You're very dedicated. Most consultants don't put in this kind of time. I want to do the job right." "Admirable." He straightened, but didn't move toward the door. "Don't work too hard, Griffin. Burnout's a real thing, especially for people who are new to this level of responsibility." The words landed like a warning. "I'll keep that in mind," Griffin said. He lingered another moment long enough to make his presence felt, then left. But he didn't go far. Through her glass wall, Griffin watched him walk to the conference room at the end of the hall. He stood at the window, looking back toward her office. Watching. Griffin waited 10 minutes, pretending to work on the Tokyo agreements. Then, moving as casually as she could manage, she saved everything to her personal cloud account, a backup, in case the thumb drive was somehow compromised. She shut down her computer, gathered her belongings, and forced herself to walk at a normal pace to the elevator. As the doors closed, she caught a glimpse of Colton still standing at the conference room window, his silhouette dark against the city lights. Griffin took a taxi home instead of the company car. She checked over her shoulder 3 times during the ride, paranoia creeping in like cold water. But the streets behind them remained ordinary, just traffic and lights and people living their lives. She arrived home at 11:45 p.m. Mrs. Chen was asleep on the couch, the television playing quietly. Griffin paid her, thanked her, waited until she heard the neighbor's door close. The children were asleep. Nova's arm hung off the bed. Hayes's stuffed elephant clutched against his chest. Griffin stood in their doorway for a long moment, watching them breathe. Then she went to the kitchen table and sat down with the encrypted drive. Her mother's photo stared back at her from the refrigerator, a snapshot from better days, before the illness, when Imani Griffin's smile could light up a room. Griffin heard her voice as clearly as if she was standing there. "Don't let them make you small." But this wasn't about being small. This was about survival. If she reported this and was wrong, she'd be fired. If she was right but couldn't prove it conclusively, she'd be fired and possibly sued for defamation. If she was right and could prove it, she might be in danger. She thought of Nova and Hayes sleeping in the next room. Their safety, their future, their stability, all of it depended on her making the right choice. But she also thought of Al Rostamani's trust, Manal's encouragement, the nameplate on her door that said she mattered. Griffin opened her laptop. She began drafting a confidential memo, fingers moving with certainty now. Subject line: urgent. Potential financial irregularities requiring immediate review. She laid out the findings systematically: the payments, the shell company, the missing documentation, the emails. She attached screenshots and financial records. She noted Colton's unexpected appearance in her office and the implicit warning in his words. Then she read it through twice, checking for accuracy, for clarity, for any weakness that could be exploited. Her finger hovered over send. She thought about what this would cost her if she was wrong. Thought about what it would cost her if she stayed silent and was right. Griffin took a deep breath and clicked. Al Rostamani's emergency board meeting convened at 7 a.m., the kind of meeting that ended careers. Griffin's phone rang at 6:15 a.m., jarring her from restless sleep. She'd been awake most of the night, staring at the ceiling and second-guessing the email she'd sent. "Miss Griffin?" Romy Dean's voice was crisp, betraying no emotion. "Mr. Al Rostamani requests your presence. Board meeting. 7 a.m. Bring all documentation." Griffin's stomach dropped. "I'll be there." She scrambled to get ready, pulling on the navy suit with shaking hands. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror looked pale, frightened. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to think clearly. Mrs. Chen arrived early, still in her nightgown, concern etched across her face. "You okay?" "I will be," Griffin said, hoping it was true. Nova appeared in the hallway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Mummy, why are you scared?" Griffin knelt, pulling her daughter close. "Mommy has to do something brave today." Hayes padded out behind his sister, clutching his elephant. "Like a superhero?" Griffin smiled through the tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "Something like that." She kissed them both, grabbed the encrypted drive, and took a taxi to the office. The city was just waking up, garbage trucks rumbling, early commuters hurrying to subways. Griffin watched it all through the window, wondering if this was the last morning she'd make this trip. She arrived at 6:55 a.m. The conference room on the 50th floor looked different in the early morning light, harsher somehow, all sharp edges and cold glass. Al Rostamani sat at the head of the table, his expression grave. Manal was present, dressed in a tailored black suit, her presence lending weight to the proceedings. Griffin remembered that she sat on the advisory board. An external auditor stood near the projection screen, a stern woman with silver hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. 2 company attorneys flanked the auditor, men in dark suits with briefcases that probably cost more than Griffin's monthly rent, and seated across the table, Sean Gregory and Colton Avery. Sean's face was pale, his jaw tight. His eyes found Griffin's immediately, and the hatred in them was palpable. Colton sat beside him, his expression carefully neutral, but his fingers drummed against the table in an anxious rhythm. Griffin took the empty seat directly across from Sean, setting her bag down carefully. The encrypted drive felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Al Rostamani waited until everyone was seated. "Miss Griffin has brought serious allegations to my attention. I've asked our external auditor to review her findings overnight." He nodded to the silver-haired woman. "Miss Zhao, please present what you found." The auditor stood, activating the projection screen with a remote. Financial documents appeared the same ones Griffin had uncovered, but now organized with additional layers of analysis. "Over the past 18 months, Miss Zhao began, her voice crisp and authoritative, $15 million have been transferred to an entity called Legacy Holdings, LLC. The payments were authorized by Mr. Sean Gregory and routed through the company's Cayman Islands subsidiary." She clicked to the next slide, showing the payment trail in stark detail. There are no corresponding project expenditures, no vendor contracts, no oversight documentation, no board approvals for any expenditure over $1 million, as required by company policy. She paused, letting the information settle. "Legacy Holdings appears to be a shell company with no operational history and no legitimate business purpose." Sean stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is a misunderstanding." "Explain," Al Rostamani said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Those payments were for strategic market positioning in emerging economies, due diligence and relationship building. It's how business works in certain regions. You can't always document everything through traditional channels." Miss Zhao tilted her head. "Can you provide documentation for these relationships?" "It's confidential. Competitive advantage. If our competitors knew our expansion strategy—" "There's no confidentiality within this board," Al Rostamani interrupted. "Provide the documentation." Sean's eyes darted to Colton, who remained silent, staring at the table. No help coming from that quarter. "I'll need time to compile everything," Sean said, his voice taking on a desperate edge. "Some of the records are off-site, some are with external partners. Mr. Gregory." Miss Zhao's voice cut through his excuses. "This is a board meeting convened specifically to address these allegations. You've had 12 hours' notice. If documentation existed, you would have brought it." Sean's jaw worked. Then he turned on Griffin, his composure cracking. "This is a witch hunt. Miss Griffin has been here 3 weeks and is already making wild accusations. She doesn't have the experience to understand." "I understand embezzlement when I see it," Griffin said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The room erupted. One of the attorneys leaned forward to speak. Manal's expression hardened. Al-Rostamani raised a hand for silence. But Sean wasn't finished. He pointed at Griffin, his hand shaking. "You were a maid. You cleaned toilets in this building. And now you think you can sit here and accuse me of—" Manal's hand slammed against the table with a crack that silenced everyone. "Enough." She stood, her presence commanding immediate attention. "Answer the question, Mr. Gregory. Where is the documentation for these $15 million? Sean's bravado collapsed. "I need time to compile it." "We've already traced the funds," Miss Zhao said quietly. "Legacy Holdings' only listed officer is Richard Morrison, your brother-in-law." The silence that followed was absolute. Sean's face crumbled. His hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. For a moment, Griffin almost felt sorry for him, watching a man's entire life implode in real time. "Almost. You're terminated effective immediately," Al-Rostamani said, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "Security will escort you from the building. You're prohibited from accessing any company systems or removing any materials." He turned to the attorneys. "File a criminal referral with the district attorney's office. Include all documentation Miss Zhao has compiled." Sean stood, his hands shaking violently now. "You'll regret this." He looked directly at Griffin, and the venom in his expression made her breath catch. "You have no idea what you've started." 2 security officers appeared at the door as if summoned. They moved to Sean's side, their presence both polite and utterly implacable. Sean allowed himself to be led out, but his eyes never left Griffin until the door closed behind him. Al-Rostamani's attention shifted to Colton, who'd been trying to make himself smaller in his chair. "Mr. Avery, did you know about this?" Colton shifted uncomfortably. I suspected something was irregular. The payments seemed unusual, but I didn't have proof." "Why didn't you report it?" The silence stretched. Colton's mouth opened, closed. No answer came that would save him. "You're suspended pending investigation," Al-Rostamani said. "Depending on what we find, you may face termination or criminal charges as well." Colton stood, his face ashen, and left without another word. The room gradually emptied, the attorneys gathering their materials, Miss Zhao promising a full written report by end of day, until only Al-Rostamani, Manal, and Griffin remained. Griffin sat in the silence, exhausted down to her bones. She'd been vindicated, yes, but she'd also made enemies, powerful ones. "You did the right thing," Manal said softly. Griffin nodded, not trusting her voice. Al-Rostamani stood, walked to the window. "This company owes you a debt. That took extraordinary courage." "I just did what needed to be done," Griffin said. He turned back to her. "That's exactly why you belong here." 6 months later, Griffin stood in the same conference room where she'd once refilled water glasses, but this time she was leading the meeting. Senior Legal Counsel J.C. Griffin read the updated nameplate on her office door now, and the title still felt surreal some mornings. But here, presenting to the board's quarterly ethics and compliance review, she'd learned to inhabit the authority that came with it. A team of 3 junior analysts sat to her right, their laptops open, ready to field technical questions. Griffin advanced to the next slide, her voice steady and professional. "Following the investigation into financial irregularities, we've implemented comprehensive oversight protocols." She gestured to the screen. "Mandatory dual authorization for all international transfers over $1 million. Quarterly third-party audits of all subsidiary transactions. And most importantly, a whistleblower protection policy." She clicked to the next slide, where the policy details appeared in clear language. "Anonymous reporting channels. Legal defense fund for employees who report violations in good faith. Zero-tolerance retaliation policy with criminal referral provisions." One board member leaned forward. "And cross-cultural legal training? Mandatory for all executives working on international deals," Griffin confirmed. "We can't expect people to navigate complex jurisdictions without proper education." Ignorance isn't an excuse, but we have a responsibility to provide the tools for compliance. Al Rostamani, sitting at the head of the table, nodded approvingly. These changes wouldn't have happened without Miss Griffin's courage. He looked around the room. She risked everything to protect this company's integrity. That deserves recognition. The applause that followed made Griffin's cheeks warm, but she accepted it with a slight nod, professional and composed. She'd learned that taking credit wasn't the same as being arrogant. It was simply acknowledging the work. After the meeting, as board members filed out discussing implementation timelines, Al Rostamani approached Griffin. "Would you join me in the lobby? There's something I'd like to show you." Griffin followed him down to the main floor, where a small gathering had assembled near the elevators. Manel stood beside a wall plaque covered with black cloth. Nova and Hayes were there too. Griffin had taken them out of school for the afternoon, though she hadn't told them why. "What's happening?" Nova whispered, clutching Griffin's hand. Al Rostamani stepped forward, his voice carrying across the lobby. 6 months ago, this company nearly lost its integrity. One person's courage saved us. But that courage didn't come from nowhere. It was taught, modeled, lived. He nodded to Manal, who pulled the cloth away. The brass plaque gleamed under the lobby lights. "In memory of Imani Turner, mother, mentor, reminder that integrity begins at home. Don't let them make you small." Griffin's vision blurred immediately. Her throat closed around words that wouldn't come. She'd requested this memorial instead of her performance bonus, but seeing it here permanent, public, honoring her mother in the place where Griffin had once been invisible, broke something open inside her. Manal embraced her, and Griffin let herself be held. "Grandma would love this," Nova said quietly, reading the inscription. Hayes tugged Griffin's sleeve. "Is that the superhero, Grandma?" Griffin knelt, pulling both children close. "Yes, baby, that's her." Nova had prepared something Griffin hadn't known. Her daughter stepped forward, unfolding a piece of paper with careful handwriting. "My grandma taught my mom to always tell the truth, even when it's hard. Now my mom teaches other people to do that too." Hayes added solemnly, "I'm proud of you, Mommy." The small crowd applauded. Griffin stood, wiping her eyes, and touched the plaque gently. The metal was cool under her fingertips, solid and real. That evening, Griffin returned to the apartment building in Queens. She'd received offers to move, could afford something better now, somewhere with more space, better schools, safer streets, but she hadn't yet. She wanted Nova and Hayes to remember where they came from, to understand that success didn't mean forgetting your roots. Mrs. Chen waited with the children, as she had countless times before, but now Griffin paid her significantly more, insisted on it despite Mrs. Chen's protests. "You've done well, JC," Mrs. Chen said as she gathered her things. "Your mother would be proud." Griffin cooked dinner using her mother's recipe jollof rice with perfectly caramelized onions, the way Imani had taught her. The apartment filled with the smell of tomatoes and spices, memory made tangible. They ate together at the small kitchen table, Nova and Hayes recounting their day at the unveiling ceremony, talking over each other in their excitement. "Mom, can I ask you something?" Nova said suddenly, her expression turning serious. "Of course. That day you spoke up in the meeting. Were you scared?" Griffin paused, setting down her fork. She could have deflected, could have made it seem easier than it was, but that wouldn't honor what her daughter was really asking. "Terrified," she said honestly. "Then why did you do it?" Griffin reached across the table, covering Nova's hand with her own. "Because staying silent would have hurt people, and Grandma Imani taught me that protecting others is more important than protecting yourself." Hayes looked up from pushing rice around his plate. "Like a superhero?" Griffin smiled. "Like someone trying to do the right thing." Late that night, after the children were asleep, Griffin sat at the kitchen table with her laptop. The email arrived at 11:47 p.m., Al Rostamani's name in her inbox, making her pulse quicken even now. Subject: Dubai Office International Expansion. She opened it. "JC, we're opening a new compliance division in Dubai to oversee all Middle Eastern operations. I'd like you to lead it. Salary: $350,000 plus performance bonuses, comprehensive relocation package housing, international school for Nova and Hayes, annual flights home. Think about it, but don't think too long." Abdullah. Griffin stared at the screen, her heart racing. She looked around the apartment, her mother's teapot on the shelf, photos of the children on the fridge, the small space that had held them together through the hardest years. This place represented survival, stability, hard-won ground she'd fought to claim. But Dubai? She remembered working in Abu Dhabi, the glass office overlooking the desert, the respect she'd earned through competence, the way her career had flourished before she'd had to choose between it and her mother. Now that choice was being offered again. Not the same circumstances, but the same essential question. Stay safe or risk growth? She opened her notebook and began making a pros and cons list, her legal training demanding structure even for personal decisions. Her phone rang. Veronica Ellison. "I heard about the Dubai offer," Veronica said without preamble. "You'd be crazy not to take it." "But I've finally found stability here," Griffin said. "Stability is important, but so is growth." Veronica's voice softened. "Your mother left her home country to give you opportunities. Maybe it's time you do the same for your kids." After the call, Griffin sat in silence. She looked at her mother's photo on the fridge, Imani smiling, vibrant, whole. Before the illness, before everything fell apart. "What would you do?" Griffin whispered. In her mind, as clearly as if Imani were standing there, came the answer. "Don't let them make you small, JC. And don't make yourself small either." Griffin opened her laptop. She began typing, her fingers moving with certainty now. The words appeared on the screen, each one a commitment, a leap, a choice to trust that she'd earned her place at the table. "Mr. Al-Rostamani, I accept your offer. When do we start?" Griffin hit send and smiled. Not because the journey was over, but because it was just beginning, and this time, she wasn't walking into rooms trying to disappear. She was walking in to make sure everyone else was seen too.